Welcome to the Lorraine Hallis Lecture on the Art and Science of Caregiving. I'm Stephanie Shivers. I am the Chief Innovation Officer here at CaringKind and Vice President of Program Development. And it's my privilege to welcome you here this evening to this lecture and discussion. If you are new to CaringKind this evening, we'd especially like to welcome you, those of you who are in the room, those of you who are joining us online, and to let you know that we are one of the country's oldest not-for-profit community-based services, serving families who are impacted by Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. We offer a wide variety of programs and services to help each of you as you're navigating your journey through this path, and we would love to talk to you about the ways that we might be able to help you. And so please feel free to reach out to those of us in the room who are with CaringKind, either tonight or following. Tonight we will be first hearing a talk from Dr. Kenneth Doka, and then he will be joined by Dr. Ann Kenny, who will be moderating our question and answer time. And for those of you who are here in the room, there are cards inside of your program, and you can jot down questions as they come up or afterwards, and we'll be collecting those and then doing the Q&A at the end. We'll give those to Ann and Ken to work through. And if you're online, you can also add questions into the chat, and we'll gather those questions and circulate those forward as well. We've got a couple hundred people in tonight, so we'll try to get all to the, to all of the questions as we can. We'll do our best. If tonight strikes you in a particular chord, again, I just want to encourage you all to access us, and we would love to be a resource for you. This lecture series was created in memory of Lorraine Hallis and is sponsored with the generous support of her family. The Lorraine Hallis Lecture on the Art and Science of Caregiving is designed to recognize caregiving as an important social, political, policy, and spiritual issue that merits thoughtful discussion and discourse. Lorraine's daughter, Doreen Skolnick, served as the primary caregiver for her mother. And unfortunately, Doreen wasn't able to join us this evening, but she has recorded a video for us to share some of her experiences.
Hi there. Thank you. When you live with someone you love who has Alzheimer's, and you have the primary responsibility for them as a caregiver, you go through so many unique stages. After 12 years in our home, the final stages of my mother's life had their own special challenges. For me personally, and my entire family, the last 18 months of my mother's life were endless torture, and yet the most incredible, incredible experience. During that last stage, that last year and a half, my mother's health kept fading. And so we needed to supplement the amazing caregivers we had over the years with my mother in our home. We called in home hospice, but that was hard. Home hospice kept trying to redefine whether my mother's needs were being met by the caregivers in our house, which were incredibly complicated for any Alzheimer's patient. The first time I had home hospice in my home, the team questioned everything that the primary caregivers were doing in my house, and that they thought that they were not enriching my mother's life. And then we had the problem that my mother, even with home hospice, did not die right away. And we had to go back to home hospice and have her recertified again for their services. We actually went through the process 4 separate times. During those times, there were major personal family life cycle events for the entire family system, including graduations, a wedding, family trips abroad. And as we prepared for each of these events, we also had to prepare for the details of my mother's death and funeral. When my son was going to get married in Canada, as difficult as a decision as it was, we reinitiated home hospice as my mother appeared critical, and we organized every possible detail of her dying process, from meeting with the funeral director to having people around her so that we could go to the wedding. My mother made it through each of these amazing family milestones. And I have to tell you, I have always believed that she knew on some level how important it was that she had to make it through and not spoil these wonderful events. But you know what? At each of these events, she wasn't there physically, and as joyful and as relieved as we were, we always felt that she wasn't there. We would like to give a very, very special thanks to my brother Jeffrey and my sister-in-law Nancy Hallis for creating the Lorraine Hallis Family Education Series, and in loving memory of my dear mother. This series truly exemplified the goals of CaringKind. We are so honored and gratified to have Dr. Kenneth Doka with us tonight. He is very insightful in describing the grief and loss, both for the patients and their families. And he is entirely correct that families need all the education and training and understanding that they can get. His perspectives are useful and important. I would like to add that for all the losses, even as we were losing my mother, we were truly gaining something. My mother raised me. My mother nurtured my husband and my children. My mother was a part of our lives. Now, looking back, both my family and I would not trade the whole experience of having my mother in our home for all the time in the world. If we had to do it all over again, we would sign up immediately. As limited as she was with us. My youngest daughter would come home every day from school and sit next to her bubby, and she watched TV and did her homework while my mother instinctively put her arm around her. My mother sat at dinner with us every night. So yes, we lost a lot, stage by stage, but even in the last years, she made us feel the kind of family that she taught us how to be. Thank you very much, and welcome again.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Suzanne Bengtsson, and I am the Vice President of Family Supports here at CaringKind, meaning,
A little louder.
sorry, I'll try. My voice doesn't project well, but I will give it a shot. I am the Vice President of Family Supports, meaning that I oversee the programs and services that we provide to family caregivers. And anybody else who's a caregiver. It doesn't have to be family, it can be friends and others that are involved with caregiving. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Kenneth Doka. Dr. Doka is a PhD and he holds a Master of Divinity. He is the Senior Vice President of Grief Programs at the Hospice Foundation of America and the recipient of the 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association of Death Education and Counseling. He is a prolific author and editor. Dr. Doka serves as editor of Hospice Foundation of America's Living with Grief book series, its Journeys newsletter, and numerous other books and publications. He has been a panelist on Hospice Foundation of America's Living with Grief program for 28 years. Dr. Doka is a past president of the Association of Death, Dying, and Bereavement, and an advisory board member to the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. He is the recipient of the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement's prestigious Hermann Feigl Award and the ADEC's Award for Outstanding Contributions in the Field of Death Education. In 2006, he was grandfathered in as a mental health counselor under New York's first state licensure for counselors. And Dr. Doka is also an ordained Lutheran minister. Welcome, Dr. Doka.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and I'm really honored and delighted that you're all here tonight. Let me begin with a sort of basic question here. Let me get this right. And the first question is, why are you here? And over the years, I've done these kinds of sessions for people who are, literally dealing with these issues rather than professionals who are assisting in dealing with these issues. And I found there were three types of people who usually come to this. First of all, it's the people who are experiencing grief, experiencing someone with dementia, experiencing the difficulties that arise in that. How many of you are in that category? Okay, good to know. And then there are the good friends who say, there's a lecture I think you should go to. I'll go with you. I'll take you out for a drink after. I may have thrown that in. You're not bound. But how many of you are in that category of sort of accompanying friends? Anybody? Okay, a couple of people. And then lastly, there are professionals. How many of you are here in a professional capacity? Okay, and what we usually find a good mix. Well, what can you expect? And the first thing is there's no magic wand. There's nothing that I can say that can take away the pain you're experiencing. When I did the first of these lectures years ago for a local funeral home I grew up in Astoria before it was fashionable. But when I was growing up in Astoria, there was a funeral home, Thomas M. Quinn and Sons. And when I came back to the neighborhood, they asked me to do a lecture to their families. And that was the first time I've ever done that. I preached, I had lectured in college, but I'd never done it to families. So I was really curious to see what their reactions would be. And I always found one comment to be both very poignant and yet humbling, and one that I constantly remember. There was a question that said, what are the limitations of the lecture? And one person had written, it didn't bring my husband back. And ultimately, bringing your person back to the way they were before or alive is the only way to really, truly deal with this. But we can't do that. But what can we do? Well, I think we can do a few things. I think the first thing we can do is to help you validate and understand your reactions. One of the commonest questions I get when I do these kinds of lectures is the question, am I going crazy? And for most of the time, the answer is no. These are the normal kinds of experiences that people have. And we can also talk about how to cope with it, but we have to do that with an individual lens. And what I mean by an individual lens is each of us handles grief differently. A number of years ago, I did a how to handle the holidays lecture for a local widows group. And one person raised her hand and said, we're approaching the first Thanksgiving, and my husband is not here. I still envision him at the head of the table cutting the turkey. Who's going to sit at the head of the table now? And I asked the group, I said, you've all dealt with it. Many of you have dealt with that issue. How have you resolved it? And I got a million different answers. One woman said, in my culture, the eldest son sat there. And another woman said, I'm in charge of the family now. I sat there. And then some people said, well, we went for a buffet, or we did things differently, or went out to eat, or went to a different house. What's the best answer? The best answer is whatever appeals to you, because we all deal with this on our own individual basis. So hopefully, as you look at this, you may see options, you may see possibilities, and it may just encourage you to think about other things outside of the box. The next year when I came back there, the woman who had asked that question came up to me. She said, you know what I finally decided to do? She says, my husband was a great sports person, and he loved watching sports on Thanksgiving, and that's what he'd love to do most. And he said, so what we decided to do was let the grandchildren race, and whoever won the race got to sit in Poppy's seat. So she heard that perfectly. You know, these are not limited options, but maybe they encourage you. And then, of course, I think what we also get from this is hope. People do get through even the most difficult and troubling situations. As a family, you've experienced dementia and you've experienced all the, whoops, what are we doing here? You experience all the losses that go with that. And remember, one of the things we want to stress is grief is not about death. Grief is about loss. We grieve divorces, we grieve separations, we grieve all those events in our lives. And in Alzheimer's, we experience lots of losses as a family. We have the loss of shared experience, the ability to say to somebody, do you remember when we went up to Maine? Remember when this happened? So we have the loss of shared experience. We may deal with chronic sorrow. That's a term by Susan Roos, and it just means we're constantly living with grief that might be spiked at different occasions. When Rabbi Skolnick spoke, one of the things that struck me is the bittersweet experience of going up to your son's wedding and knowing how much your mother would have really enjoyed that, but she's not experiencing it. You know, those constant spikes of grief. We experience psychosocial loss. The person we're with is especially for a spouse, is still there, but they're not the person they were. And we have almost an experience of being a hidden widow or widower. You can see my Latin education there with the term crypto. And of course, we may have anxiety over the unpredictability of disease. What's going to happen next and what kinds of behaviors am I going to have to encounter? And sometimes we experience the loss of image, that we may find things about the person that we never saw before. My classic case of that, or one of my classic cases of that, is a woman from Alabama. The mother was from Alabama, and the woman was Caucasian. She was white, and she had been a participant, and her daughter was very proud that she had been a participant in the early civil rights struggle. She marched to Selma. And that was brave for a white woman in Alabama in the 1950s and 1960s. That was dangerous stuff. But then when her mother got Alzheimer's, she started making all kinds of racist statements and using words that she had never used before. And so to her daughter, that was a terrible event. Who was my mother really? Was she that brave woman, that crusader, or was there something else? Why is this happening? And some of you may have experienced that loss of image. And then how many of you have been caregivers? Yeah, okay, a few. Again, the loss of independence that goes with that, the loss of the assumptive world. You heard that I was a minister, right? Do weddings on occasion. Now we have what we call the sleepover rule. That, if you were a friend of my son's and you slept over the house, or my godson, I'll probably do your wedding. But we're limiting it a little bit. But we all have assumptions. I always think the reason I mentioned that is I always wonder if we included a vow, and when the time comes and my mate has dementia, my partner has dementia, I will change his diapers and take care of him. I wonder how many people would say, I think we got to rethink this if that was a wedding vow. You don't expect that. We lose friends, not necessarily because friends desert us, but we're so busy, we're so involved. This consumes so much time. We have so little free time. And then, of course, the financial and lifestyle losses. And here's an important thing to remember. This was a major study that was done that showed over 4 years, caregivers, whatever they were dealing with, whether it was a physical illness, a disability, dementia, faced significant higher health risks than people who weren't involved, their peers who weren't involved in caregiving. And so really what I want to emphasize to you is one of the most important things you can do is to monitor your own health and practice good self-care. How many of you have ever ridden on airplanes? I guess just about everybody, right? Remember the first piece of wise advice when you get on an airline, put the mask on yourself before you help somebody else. I once flew on an American Airlines flight. I generally fly on American Airlines, and one of the flight attendants was a little bit. It was very funny. And she said, you know, if you're traveling with children, put the mask on before you put the mask on your child. If you have more than one child, quickly decide who you love most. Always remembered that line. We have to understand our caregiver burden. It's hard to be a caregiver. And it's interesting, these are some things that really make it harder. Sleep, and you can understand those, and you can get into those. It's pretty easy. Sleep disturbances, harder when your sleep is constantly. I was a caregiver of my father. My father didn't have dementia. He had cancer. But, you know, we and I had two other siblings. We all took turns, you know, two nights a week, 3 nights a week, depending on the week. And, you know, and I really realized that in the 2 days that I do it, I couldn't get much sleep because my father, you know, would need to use the restroom. He would need to use something. Sleep disturbances were really constant. Incontinence, of course, makes it harder. Dementia in and of itself makes it harder. And when the person's non-ambulatory, that makes it harder. All those are important. But even more important is your past relationship. You know, and that's something to think about. And what I mean by that is if you had a very good relationship, let's say you're taking care of your spouse, your partner, or your parent. If you had a good relationship, well, you know, turnabout's fair play. They were always there for me. I've got to be there for them. But if you had a very difficult and ambivalent relationship, caregiving can become even tougher. Now you resent the fact that, you know, they never took care of you, or they always created difficulties. Now I'm stuck taking care of them. So always be aware of that. Respite care is important. Again, that's that mask, that oxygen. You need time aside. You need time to rejuvenate and rest. It reduces the stress of caregiving. It even has physical benefits, allows the immune system to recover. And it improves your patience and allows the caregiver to attend to personal responsibilities or even to seek out the self-help they need. Really can't stress the importance of respite. But let's face it, sometimes there's difficulties in accepting respite care. You know, we often fear that no one's going to take as good care of the patient as I would. We're reluctant to leave them. So I always say start small. You know, get somebody in who's going to help you, who can take care of that person. Stay in a different room. Stay in your bedroom and read or watch TV for 3 hours just to get that break. And then maybe another time you can take 4 hours off in the afternoon and actually go see a flick or go out with friends. And then maybe as you gain more confidence in the people who are taking care in the process, you'll be able to do something more significant. And some nursing homes may offer respite care or daycare. That might be a good opportunity for respite. And certainly you can check with CaringKind and see what they know. Eleanor is going to give you a private cell phone at the end of this presentation. So you can do it. I'm only kidding on that part. Well, first of all, we have to understand that caregiving and dementia is not easy on anybody's part. You know, and again, think about, you know, one of the things I always say, and I said today earlier in a professional lecture, is one of the problems we have in understanding dementia is we don't always understand the psychological process of memory. Memory is one of the most interesting, distinct, and badly misunderstood psychological processes. We don't really know how memory works fundamentally. So we don't know how diseases about memory work. And memory loss is both gradual, you know, as people lose things. And I remember one client who said to me, I used to remember your name. You know, he knew that he couldn't retrieve it now, but he knew he used to know it. And then collectively profound. And think about memory. Memory is a link to past, our present, our future. And if we lose memory, we lose all those connections. And those are powerful connections. My sister took care of her mother-in-law, and she had always had a close relationship with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law always called her, sometimes in inappropriate places like at family gatherings, the best daughter-in-law she had. which didn't endear my sister to her, the other sister-in-laws of the three other brothers. But in any case, toward the end of her life, as her dementia became more profound, she never remembered my sister's name. She remembered, and she described her as the woman who married my son. And again, and my sister had difficulty with that at times, you know, because again, we're human. And even though we know something on a cognitive level, it doesn't always approach us on an emotional level. And of course, when we lose memory, we lose other roles. Well, what about grief and dementia? Early in the process, the person may have accessible grief that we know we're declining. We may even know our diagnosis. We know we have dementia, and we grieve that. I was telling the earlier group that this year, when I went to my conference of ADEC, the Association for Death Education and Counseling, one of my colleagues was there, brilliant scholar from Massachusetts, did groundbreaking work on suicide and devastating deaths. But he announced to the group that he was in the early stages he had just been diagnosed with dementia. And this was his opportunity to say goodbye to his colleagues. And all the grief that entails in knowing what happens. Later in the disease, people have a sense of what we might call wrong-being. Just like there's well-being, feel good today, there's wrong-being. You know something's wrong, but you don't quite know what it is. And then, of course, later, Dick Kalish suggests that people actually experience a psychological death. He describes that as not only does he not know who he is, he does not know that he is. And again, the important thing to remember is that individuals with dementia may still experience grief and loss. They may be unable to retain the fact that a person has died, and then constantly keep asking about it, trying to retrieve, why isn't my wife visiting me? Why isn't my partner coming? Well, she died 2 years ago. And they may confuse earlier losses with new ones. How do you deal with someone who has dementia? And the answer is, I'm not always sure. First of all, it's almost like a scientific method. You have to observe what times are more difficult for them. When does this client, for example, when does this person seem agitated? And then what happened? What seemed to agitate? What seemed to calm? It's a trial and error kind of thing. And then you can experiment. Does this work? Does that work? Sometimes it works to just to validate the person and say, you seem very upset. Let's take a walk, or let's do this. And other times it's just better, if somebody says, where's my husband? Well, they're coming later, even though they're not coming. And again, there's value in just simply validating the feelings that people have. Well, people with dementia eventually die. And what can we say about at the time of death? How should we handle it? Well, first of all, I always say there are 2 rules in grief. You want to know these 2 rules in grief? First rule is there are no rules. Never forget the first rule. The second rule, if I were going to make a rule, would be try not to make rapid changes in the first 6 months to a year. Now, again, there may be exceptions to that. There may be things you can't stop, but you're already dealing with the stress of grief. And moving is stressful. 37 years ago, I moved from Astoria to Poughkeepsie, New York. And I decided that slash and burn economies we had a lot to learn from them. I think the next time I'm just going to burn the house down and just get new property. That's probably arson and probably not a good thing to do. But how many of you have had the stress of moving? Well, imagine combining that stress with the stress of grief. And grief really is, at its heart, a stress reaction. That's what it is. We need to allow grief, not to hold it in. We need to sort of energize our support systems. What really helps? And what I always often suggest that people do is they make a list. If you came into me for counseling, whether it was for caregiving, whether it was for loss and grief, I'd say, okay, let's start with something. I want you to make a list of your support system. Most people have them. And then I want you to put a D next to all the people who are good doers. People you can count You need something done, you need something picked up at the store, they're more than happy to do it. And then an L for people who are good listeners. You need to call somebody, they're always open. You call them at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're honored that you chose them to call. These are good people. They're listeners. Not that the doers aren't good people too, but these are all different ways that people can assist you. And then the last category is R. These are what I call respite people. Caregiving, grief is hard work. And there are times when you're doing that you need some time off. Just like any hard work, you can't do it all the time. You need to go out. You need to have some respite. You need to have some time where you rejuvenate your own batteries, so to speak, where you take that oxygen. These are the people you can go out with, and never once they're going to say, how are you really doing? Because they hope against hope you don't talk about it. But that's their gift to you. Their gift to you is they give you time away. And then, of course, we can utilize rituals that help us and the like. And of course, it's important to remember that this grief will continue after the death of the person. And there may be special issues. You may try to why did this happen? What was the disease process? We may cope with difficult emotions, ambivalence, for example. We often have, when we're dealing in caregiving, there's a lot of ambivalence. We want the person to be around, but it's stressful to care for that person. We may feel guilt. We may feel regret. And relief is not an uncommon. There's a wonderful book out there by Ellison and McGonagall called Liberating Losses. And they remind us that sometimes especially after a long caregiving experience, relief is not an uncommon emotion. And sometimes we feel guilty about it, but it's not an uncommon emotion. Some losses are liberating. We kind of feel a sense that their suffering is over, my suffering is over, and then both our sufferings are over. And sometimes people say, I'm really worried because I'm not grieving. And what they really mean is that I'm not experiencing sadness or loneliness or the things we typically think about as grief. But in reality, that reaction is a grief. Grief is simply a reaction to our loss. And those can be all kinds of different things. We have to realistically plan for the future. And again, life can't be just resumed. We just can't say, okay, I'm going to go back to the way my life was, because the world has moved on in the years that you've been struggling with this. We may have to process the secondary losses we experience, and sometimes it's even the caregivers who we've been associated with during the course of the illness. We developed a relationship with that nurse's aide and that caregiver who came to the house. And Gaines, Sanders always has 3 questions. They're good questions to guide you as you navigate through grief. And I'll talk about them again a little bit later on, just briefly. But what do I want to, but the point she's making is you're moving into a new phase of life. What do I want to take from my old life into my new life? What do I need to leave behind? Well, you might want to take the good memories you had. You might want to leave behind some of the bad memories you've had, or some of the anger and bitterness you may feel. And what do I need to add? You may need to develop some new skills. You may have to cope with spiritual questions. And then again, we have to respond to change. What has changed? And sometimes it helps to process what I call the surprises. How many of you have found that people you thought you could count on weren't there for you? Anybody in that category? Yeah. And how many of you felt the other way around? Here's like a stranger or somebody I didn't know that well, I didn't have much expectation of. They really stepped up to the plate. They really were there for me in a way that I never thought they could be. And to look at how we cope. What's positive? What's negative? We also have to realize that we experience different kinds of losses. I love this little cartoon. What happened to our sexual relations? I don't know. I don't even think we got a Christmas card from them this year. But as much as we joke about it, those are real losses. We experience a loss of familiarity. We experience a loss of intimacy. Intimacy is an important part of a relationship, particularly a married relationship or a partnering relationship. We may experience a loss of hope. It's not going to go well from here. The loss of future plans. The loss of social and recreational interactions. We experience all these losses. So what is grief and how do we deal with it? Well, as we said, grief is a reaction to loss. It's very individual. How many of you remember the stage theory of grief? You go through these 5 stages, forget about it. Delete it from your inner drive. We are very individual. We each grieve in our own ways. Our relationships are different. The circumstances of the death and our life are different. The support we have is different. Our health is different. It's harder to cope with grief when you're coping with your own illness and your own difficulties and disabilities. And, and how does our culture and how does our spirituality help us, or in some cases complicate our reactions? These are all real issues, and grief is very, very individual, and it affects us in many ways. How many of you have ever experienced grief physically? Your stomach's upset, yeah, all those kinds of things. Yeah. And again, we experience that, that very differently. When I'm grieving, I tend to find my stomach's upset. Other people may feel pains and tensions and different kinds of experiences like that. Emotionally, what are some of the emotions you've experienced?
Depression.
We'll call it sadness.
I'm sorry.
We'll call it sadness. And the reason I'm calling it sadness is we use depression very loosely. Depression is a mental illness. And it should, and it has a certain criteria. But, and so hopefully, sometimes grief converts into a depression, especially if you had a history of depression. But we often experience sadness, right? What other kinds of reactions? Anger, yeah. The very term bereaved, it could actually comes from a Latin root. See, my seminary education was not a waste. Comes from a Latin root that essentially be translated as the 70s expression to be ripped off. Really, bereaved means having something ripped away from you. Literally, it's the Latin root. And, and naturally, if all of a sudden I ran out of here and grabbed one of your pocketbooks that maybe was in the, in the aisle, your natural reaction would be one of anger, right? Who would you be angry at? Who would you be angry at in a situation like that?
It's the person that disappointed me.
Yeah, me, right? But you also might be, angry at Eleanor. Why did you get this guy if you knew he had this bad habit? And especially if you couldn't catch me. Guilt, regret, almost any emotion can be associated with grief. And some of these emotions can even be positive emotions. And what I mean by that is we already talked about relief, but for instance, I did a study of caregivers, and many caregivers actually felt one of their preeminent reactions was a sense of pride. I never thought I could do this as long and as well as I did it. I feel good about that. I was able to keep him at home as long as I could, or whatever I did. And some people feel that sense. It affects the way we think. How many of you have gone down the stairs after a death to get something, and when you get down there, you can't remember what you went down there to get? Yeah, okay. Once I had a man say, more than usual. Well, whatever your line is, yeah, more than usual. It affects how we behave. It affects us even spiritually. And grief is kind of like a roller coaster. And what I mean by that, Strobe and Schutt call it a dual process, because when we're grieving, we have 2 different kinds of experiences to deal with. On one hand, we have to adjust to a life without the person. And the other thing is we have to grieve. So we oscillate. We go between the both of us. We have our ups and downs, our good days, our bad days. Some of them are predictable. Some of them are not. We all have our own individual pathways. The reason I have this lilacs here is that a number of years ago, I was one of my students was counseling a woman who had lost her husband after a bout of dementia, lost her mother, I'm sorry, after a bout of dementia, after she had dementia. And when she came into counseling, the student counselor always started out by saying, "How are you doing?" And the woman said, "You know what's strange? When I woke up this morning, I felt really good." And she used the roller coaster metaphor. And she said, "When I got downstairs and got into my car to come to see you, I sort of plunged." And my student said, "Do you think it's because you were coming to counseling?" And she said, "No, I think that's why I woke up feeling good." Later, she left a message for the student, said, "I figured it out." She said, "When I got home, I smelled the smell of lilacs blooming." And the student said, "And lilacs, the next session, and lilacs reminded you of my mother?" And she laughed. And she said, "My mother had this big bottle of toilet water that you got in Woolworths, like by the gallon. It had this light purple color to it, and the strong, strong smell of lilacs, very cheap." And she said, "I hate it when my mother wore that. And every birthday, I'd get her some really nice, subtle perfume. And I'd smell it the next time, and then it'd be back to the damn lilacs." So without even recognizing it, without, some of the things, we know the holidays are going to be tough. We know birthdays, we know anniversaries are going to be tough, but sometimes we're taken by surprise. Now, there's no timetable to grief. For most people, over time, pain lessens. We return to similar, sometimes better levels of functioning. Sometimes we learn things in the grief process, but we always continue a bond with the person. And that's one of the ways that really our understanding of grief has changed. We have memories of that person. We never lose those. The person has legacies. My dad, every morning, first thing I do when I wake up is I make a color-coded list of the things I'm supposed to do that day. Soon I'll be able to cross off presentation number 2. Okay. Because I did an earlier presentation here. So I make a list of things to do. My dad kept a list. My 52-year-old son keeps a list. My grandson and granddaughter don't, but we have hopes they're still young. We have those legacies, right? We have those memories. And sometimes we have the liabilities too. And we have all these connections that never cease. And it's important to remember we always keep that continuing bond with that person. They're part of our biography. If you knew me and you knew my parents, you'd see some of my father in me and some of my mother in me. My son, when he was younger, would sometimes turn to me and say, "You're obsessing with this, you're obsessing like this, just like grandpa does." And he says, "That's not a compliment." We return to similar, better levels of functioning, as I said. And here's an important thing to remember. The lessening of grief is not the end of memory or attachment. Some people hold on to their grief because they're fearful. If they stop grieving, they'll lose the connection. You will never lose that connection. Sometimes the pain actually keeps you. I tell my clients who are grieving that the first sign you're doing better is when you're able to laugh at a story about the person who died. That's a sign that things are going well. We can now enjoy the memories as the pain ebbs. But grief is a journey. And what I mean by that is we live with the loss. We don't get over it. I always told my class, Eleanor can attest to that. She was a former student of mine, that I always used to tell them, bring closure to the term closure. We never get closure. We live with our loss. And it may be, a number of years ago, my son called me up, not an unexpected call, but I didn't expect it right at that time, and said, "Guess what, Dad? You just have a new grandson, your first grandchild." And he said, "Guess what we named him?" And my son was close to my father. I said, "Frank?" And he said, "No, Kenneth, after you." And I was thrilled, naturally. What I ended up doing after I hung up with him is I started to dial my father. And then I realized he had been dead for a decade. And even in that moment of tremendous joy and tremendous pride, I had a surge of grief. I really wanted him there for that moment. I really wanted my mother there for that moment. And that's very normal in the grief. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. We still experience those surges of grief. What can happen? This picture here, any of you ever gone spelunking? Any spelunkers in the crowd? Not one, huh? And there's a spelunking group right in Manhattan you should know about. What's it called? I forget the name of it. I used to belong to it when I lived in Manhattan. This is one of my godsons. He was the only godson who I ever could get, or only child I was involved with, or I ever get to go caving with me. My son was born a business person, and if I said, Michael, you want to go caving? He'd say, what profit is there in that? You know, he's director of compliance for Bloomberg right now. You know, it was fated from his first days. But Scott was more adventuresome. Scott went with me. And if you go caving, especially in the Northeast, caving is one of those experiences where you have to crawl at times. Caves are made by water dissolving limestone over eons. And so caves are wet and they're muddy and they're dirty. And sometimes you have to crawl and sometimes you have to slither. This was at the very beginning of the caving experience. At the end of the caving experience, he was in deep water. I mean, he was in mud up to his chest. When we brought him home, his mother said, we can save the sneakers, but just take everything else off and throw it in the garbage. I don't even want to deal with it. But we were in I can't remember the name of the cave. It was just outside of Albany. And at the end of the cave, it looks like the cave ends. But at the end of the cave is a place called the Pinch. And it looks like you're ending, and there's like a pond there, because there are all kinds of interesting things in caves, waterfalls and all kinds of things. We'll have a sign-up sheet outside for a caving expedition that Eleanor is going to lead outside of Albany. Okay, so in case you want to experience this, you can do that. In any case, so we get to a point, and he's 11 years old at this point in time, where the cave, it looks like the cave ends, but there's actually a passageway that you have to walk to about 3 or 3 feet of water maybe. It's about a foot under, and you have to crawl like go like this, hand in hand, through about a 3-foot passage to get to the other side of the cave. And he was terrified about that. And I said, Scott, I said, if you don't want to do it, I said, we can go back the way we came. And he thought 5 minutes out this way or an hour and a half out the other way, at the beginning of the cave. He kind of swallowed hard and said, let's just do it. And so we did it. Again, remember the sign-up sheet outside for those of you who want to do this. Warts Gregory was the name of the cave. And that marvelous about memory. It's a good example of how we can just retrieve something I hadn't thought about in years. Catherine Sanders, so at the end of it, when Scott got through it, I really wanted to commend him and commend his bravery and really say that's pretty spectacular for you to do that, to confront your fears. And he was very proud of himself. And he says, like my dad said, and his dad was obviously a good friend to make me his godfather. And I said, what did your dad say? And he said, my dad said, there are times in life where you have to grow up or grow down. I thought that was pretty cool and pretty wise for an 11-year-old. And there are those times in our life, and grief is one of those times. We're going to change. We're going to change in grief. But are we going to change positively, or are we going to change negatively? Catherine Sanders chose to change positively. Catherine Sanders was a colleague of mine, but Catherine Sanders had her own interesting experience. How many of you remember the old TV show, I Led 3 Lives? A couple of us. You remember it? YouTube. What? YouTube. Okay. I Led 3 Lives came out of the McCarthy era time. It was a pretty popular TV show in the early 1950s. Remember the McCarthy era? And the person who led 3 lives was like an insurance salesman, some white collar worker, but he was also a secret member of the Communist Party. But he was a double agent for the FBI. Those were his 3 separate lives. So every week we had to see him unfoil some nefarious communist plot against the United States without exposing his identity. So he could keep feeding that information to, to the FBI about all the plots that were going on. Catherine Sanders actually used to say, I actually led 3 lives. She started out as a high fashion model in the 50s, actually even dated Howard Hughes. And then became a military wife, fell for a dashing Coast Guard commander by the name of Herschel Sanders, married him and raised her 3 children on Coast Guard bases. All, of course, were close to the water. And one day, as she was at a base in Pensacola, Florida, she was watching her 15-year-old son, Jimmy, water ski, and a boat crossed his tow line. He crashed into the boat and was killed instantly. Xander's 3rd life was she decided to study grief. This was in the 1960s, and as she said, it took me about 2.5 hours to read everything that was written at that point in time. So she decided to do some research on grief, and was a formidable presence in the field. And she said, people go through a number of phases. She had an instrument to measure it. And she said, the first phase is shock. You're just shocked. And even in chronic conditions, Terry Rando another colleague, has a wonderful statement. She says, most people today die suddenly in the midst of chronic illness. We know they're going to die, but they don't always die the moment we expect them to die. And then there's an awareness of loss when grief is quite profound. And then there's a period, what she calls conservation and withdrawal. And what she means by conservation withdrawal is the person's functioning. Everything looks like they're normal. Their scores are down a little bit in terms of their grief scores, but they're still pretty high. And as they say, it takes all my energy just to get through the day. That's, I have little energy for anything else. And then she said that people face a turning point. They face a decision in this phase. Some people will die. They just don't take care of themselves. And we know the high morbidity and mortality rate in older, widows and widowers. Other people will just stay there. They'll maintain the status quo. I counseled one woman whose sister died. Her sister was her best friend, her companion. They lived together. Sister died of a sudden brain aneurysm, and she went into counseling with me. And after a while, and we were working together well, she said, when my sister was alive, it was like being in a colored TV comedy. Life was very rich, it's full of fun. And she said, when she died, it was like somebody yanked the plug out. And she said, working with you, the TV's back on, but it's black and white. And I said, we can get the color back. And she looked at me and she said, I don't want to. I don't want to live life in the same way after my sister died. So she had really chosen to say, I'm going to maintain the status quo. And other people, of course, really have a turning point experience, and they'll reach a state of renewal, which Sanders reached. And Bill Warden talks about what he calls 4 tasks of grief. So as we're grieving, we have certain things we need to do. First of all, we have to accept the reality of the loss. Funerals and other kinds of rituals help us do that. And talking freely about the loss really helps. A second task is we have to experience our emotions. There's no need to bottle our feelings, to wear a mask. We may have business we have to finish. We may have to deal with our ambivalence, especially in cases like dementia, where the ambivalence is likely to be very high and complicating our grief. And we have to plan for difficult times. If you were my client now, one of the things we'd be talking about in therapy is, how are you going to handle the holidays? What are you going to do? Who are you going to be with? What decisions are you going to make? We have to adjust to life without the person. We have to assess all the changes that our life has gone through, what we've lost and what we've gained. Sometimes we gain things. We have to cope and assess our loneliness. We have to draw from our strengths and then avoid past weaknesses. We have to deal with those secondary losses, whatever they are. And then again, we have to get support. What we talked about earlier is that DLR. And we have to continue the bond. Build in moments to remember. I have another godson, Keith, and his father died. It was a good friend of mine, and died the day before Keith turned 4. He was my godson. And And every Christmas, we have a big open house. And the day before the open house, which is on a Saturday, on Friday night, we have a family gathering to decorate the tree. And the first 3 ornaments we put on are 3 memorial ornaments for my mother and my father and for Keith's father. And it's a way of saying, we're bringing you into the holiday. You're still part of us. We want you to know that. And again, Catherine Sanders, 3 questions. And then sometimes these losses may challenge our spirituality and assumptions. So one of the questions we have to ask is, how does our faith, how does our philosophy, whatever it is, speak to us? What does it offer us? What beliefs are therapeutic or helpful? What practices can be useful? What rituals empower us to experience our loss and deal with it? What about the community? Can we find support there in our faith or philosophical community? And again, there are all kinds of resources that we can deal with. Books, some wonderful self-help books, self-help groups, educational lectures, all the services that CaringKind offers to you. And of course, counseling, take the resources you do. I always love this quote from Thornton Wilde: "The highest tribute to the dead is not grief, but gratitude." The people who have died have touched our lives. We've been part of their lives. We've shared struggles together, and sometimes with dementia, those struggles are profound. But we love them in our own way, and they loved us in their own way. And now we have to deal with their loss. But again, with a sense of thankfulness, I hope. Thank you so much for being with you today, and we're going to have time for some questions. And I look forward to our further dialogue. So thank you very, very much. We got some questions, I take it.
We do. Hello?
Hello again. While Dr. Doka and Dr. Kenny get settled, I'm gonna introduce Dr. Kenny, who is going to be doing the Q&A together with Dr. Doka. So Kenny is an MD. She is a professor emerita of medicine with a specialty training and board certification in geriatric medicine and palliative and hospice care. She has been a practicing physician for over 35 years and has been recognized by her peers as a top doctor in geriatric medicine. Dr. Kenny has worked clinically as a geriatrician in nursing homes, assisted living, rehab, and clinical outpatient settings. Dr. Kenny has found joy in her work with individuals and their families managing issues related to the diagnosis of dementia. Her experience in partnering in the care of these families touched close to home when her own mother was diagnosed with dementia. Dr. Kenny joined her mother and her brothers and sisters to provide the best care for her mother during the early and middle years following her mother's diagnosis. Her expertise, coupled with her mother's playful spirit and her siblings' openness, support, intelligence, and compassion, allowed for the highest functioning and independence of her mother for several years. And also writes books. She is the author of Making Tough Decisions about End-of-Life Care and Dementia. And another book, her second book, co-authored with Teresa Webb, Your True North, a guided journal for those living with cognitive loss or dementia about legacy, love, and wishes for the end of life well lived, for the end of a life well lived, offers a guide for persons experiencing cognitive loss to begin to explore their thoughts and wishes about their life and to prepare for the changes that dementia will bring.
And if you follow the chronology, she started when she was 15 as an MD.
No, I did not. But my mother died 13 years ago today.
Oh,
So so I've lived as a caregiver for somebody living with dementia. And I can say 13 years later that everything that Dr. Doka says is true. How's that?
That's great.
And there's other kudos that I'll tell you about that
Okay.
other people have written about you.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining me for this question and answer period.
I'm honored and delighted.
Yeah. So I mixed some of my questions in with everybody else's, and I think we're kind of on the same page. One question you did speak early on a little bit about people living with dementia and their feeling of loss and grief in the early stages. And one, at CaringKind, we really value the lived experience and people in early stages. And so we're wondering, I mean, my question was, do you know of any programs where grief is involved in peer support for people living with dementia? Or when somebody is supporting somebody who's living with dementia, what are your recommendations for helping them express that loss and grief and feel that loss and grief and process that loss and grief?
This is the person with dementia?
And then, so how can we help those people?
Those people with dementia process their grief. I think, sometimes we have this, what I call Band-Aid approach, that when a person we're dealing with who has a disease or a difficulty, dementia, or even a physical disease, we want to make them feel better. And so the first thing we end up saying is, if you would say to me, I feel so anxious or fearful, I don't know what the future holds. Pretty much what this person said, well, don't worry, we'll be there for you. We'll be okay. I think it's sometimes just important to say, talk about it with me, and allow them to really explore that feeling with support, and not trying to say, oh, well, don't worry about that. That disenfranchises grief, that devalues grief. Sometimes it's just allowing them the opportunity to be sad, to express their sense of loss. And that, and to be honest, that's easy to say. It's hard to do when you love that person. It's hard to see our loved ones in pain, emotional and psychological pain. But yet that's how they come to terms with that pain, rather than just trying to say, well, don't worry about it. We'll take care of that. Or don't worry about it till it comes. These are real fears.
So what I'm hearing is we probably need to work on our ability to sit in some of those difficult emotions ourselves.
Yeah.
Because as a society, we kind of push
negative
emotions or difficult emotions.
I think very much
into
so.
a corner.
Yeah, and that's just generally, we find it hard to tolerate our own pain and hard to tolerate the pain of others. And sometimes by acknowledging that pain, that's actually more supportive.
Yeah. I know with my mom, I used to say, man, that sounds scary. Do you want to talk more about
exactly.
it? So I needed a kind of a catchphrase or something to help me lean in, because the first inclination is to say, it'll be okay. We can make that better.
Yeah. And again, as children particularly, or as partners particularly, we don't like to see our partner in pain.
Yeah.
We do that all the time in grief.
Right. Next, you had mentioned making sense as one of the the things we should do. And you talked about understanding the disease process as part of handling grief. And what I'm wondering about is, so educational programs like this help us with that, making sense and understanding the disease and getting there. But it's one thing to be in a room like this and understand it in our head.
Cognitively.
But because of your experience and your background, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of like behind the curtain, Dr. Oz. How do we get it from our head down to our heart? What would you say to people? How can you take some of what we learn, what we try to educate people about, and not just intellectually understand it, but kind of live it?
Well, and that's that's a very good question, and probably the most difficult question that you have for me tonight, because it's a process of adaptation, and there's no easy answer to that, But for instance, I had a situation where a client was deeply disturbed that and this person was a prestigious, he was actually a rabbi in the community and well-known and well-respected. And one time when they were in the supermarket together with his wife who had dementia, she just squatted on the floor and had a bowel movement. And of course, he was in a supermarket. And he was, of course, mortified and deeply disturbed by that, and
for her
and for him,
right?
And deeply embarrassed by it. And in a situation like that, sometimes, well, you can realize, that's not something she would normally do, but, but again, as the process of dementia ensues, some of the normal restraints on behavior. Now, it's one thing to be able to say that, and I totally agree with you. It's harder. You have to process that
Yeah.
to feel it. But, I think over time, one of the most difficult struggles is to say, I had one person who used to say, he used to talk about his wife and his wife with dementia as almost two separate personalities, two separate people. And that was a very helpful thing for him to make that distinction. My wife would never do that, but my wife with dementia, I don't know what she could do, and that was a way of bringing it close to home. But again, each of us has to process that in our own way and in our own struggle.
So a little bit of trial and error.
A little bit of
until you
trial and
get to
error,
trial Success.
and to take it to trial and success if
Okay.
we're good at it and if we work on it.
Yeah.
But again, but the information is the first part.
Okay, yeah.
Because if you have to have the information up here before it can even move down there.
Okay.
So, so they're both valuable. And then, sometimes self-help groups would be the way to
Yeah, to move it.
To move it
like
to the heart,
way to
yeah.
Practice it.
the way to practice it and move it
Because
to the
like
heart.
that processing. You
Yeah.
need some kind of practice.
You need some kind of practice.
Anything new is hard.
Yeah. And then hearing other people say, yeah, I had to deal with that too.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, I guess it's not an uncommon issue with dementia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So multiple questions actually are, how do I deal with the feelings of anger and frustration that come up with caregiving? And I guess I'm gonna add on to that, how do I allow grief? Our society, I think honestly, our society's message is either to move on, get over it.
Get closure.
Or don't be angry.
Yeah.
Don't be frustrated. So how do you imagine people find space and support to handle anger, frustration, grief?
Hopefully through their support system, through those listeners we talked about, we'll help them process it. And then, there's a great article by Colin Murray Parks. Colin Murray Parks is a British guy, just died in his 90s recently. And Colin Murray Parks wrote a wonderful article once called "Who Needs Grief Support? Who needs grief support? Who needs counseling? Who needs groups?" And his answer was, if you don't have the support system, that's when it's most useful.
Okay.
So again, if you're not getting it from your support system, either because they're not, they're absent or they're not capable of doing that, it really helps to join a group of like-minded individuals struggling with the same problem, because that's where you can find validation.
Okay.
And let me just say one thing. Good groups, how do you know you're in a good group? A good group doesn't just ventilate your emotions. A good group also says, how do you cope with that? What do we do with that? And that's what you want in a group, or else it just becomes sharing horrible stories and sharing anguish. So you want both of those things.
Yeah. So that idea makes me think of resilience.
Yeah.
Bringing up resilience and how do we foster that kind of resilience? Positive psychology suggests things like focusing on gratitude, something you can be grateful for,
Yeah.
and something new all the time. And you talked about what are those positive surprises?
Yeah, yeah.
What's some of your suggestions for people to foster that kind of resilience?
Well, I think one of the things that we recognize is, there's been studies of resilient people and resilience and grief.
Mhm.
And some of those studies emphasize that you're able to find the positive even in the most negative situations. The person who you never expected to step up, who stepped up, the support that you're getting, which you didn't expect to get. And also things that, for instance, focus on your strengths. You've dealt with crises before. Everyone in this room, and I don't care how young you are, has had to deal with crises probably since grade school, if not before, right? We've all had situations where we experience difficulty from our very youngest years. What were to really explore, what were the strengths you can count on? What are the weaknesses that you want to avoid? And then the other thing is, how do you define the situation? It goes back to early sociology. What's the definition of the situation? Is this a disaster or is this a challenge?
Mhm.
And it's that ability to see situations as challenges that really is the key to resilience.
Really, it is that mindset,
Yeah,
because they talk about stress. Stress can be, it can give you a physiologic response that's negative if you think of stress as negative.
yeah,
If you think of stress as a challenge,
yeah.
you actually get a whole different
Perspective. Yeah,
and you get a whole different physiology.
yeah, yeah.
Like, same situation, different
The
focus.
perception.
But as you have the lenses, can you switch your lens
Can you
just
switch
a
around?
half step?
Yeah, and again, the piece of that is look to your past strengths.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So that's the past strength lens.
Yeah, that's the
Versus
past strengths.
This is a challenge.
Yeah,
Or this is
Both
a
lenses.
crisis.
yeah. It's like one of those big, good cameras from when we used cameras. That would have the multiple lenses you could put on
The better.
and the
film.
filters,
The
yeah.
ones that have multiple
Yeah,
cameras. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to harken back to some of Sanders' questions.
Yeah.
And really, and this is probably similar to the last, but to begin to heal and renew yourself. That was when she had the shift in focus and
Yeah.
then to renewal and heal. I found personally, when I was going through this and when I counsel others, to take that time for reflection and contemplation are crucial, both in the time when I was supporting my mom living with dementia and when my mom died
yeah.
from dementia. And the people that I counsel. What's your experience in guiding people kind of in that, how to find their renewal, and how to instill that hope and envision something different? You talked about it won't be the same.
Yeah, it won't be the same.
How do you help get them to that? It won't be the same.
Well, you have to, and again, I always think, that the key to counseling is that you are a facilitator. You have to bring it out in the person. So some of my questions would be, for example, if you were a client of mine, envision the life you'd like to lead.
Mhm.
Where would you like to go from this? So, what is your goal? And then once you determine your goal is, maybe you say, I wish I could get rid of some of the guilt that I experienced because, it was tough. And sometimes I lost my temper. I mean, when my father was dying, he was not dying of dementia. But he was dying. And one time he said, would you lower the shade? So I lowered the shade. He said, too much. Would you rise it? Now, so we're playing with like the end of this after about 15 minutes, 2 inches. Now you went a little too far. And I lost it. I wrote the book, Counseling Individuals' Life-Threatening Illness, and I lost it.
I never lost it.
yeah, of course not.
Never.
Well, I suspected that.
Yeah.
But I mean, and after that, I felt guilty about that. I mean, here I am. I literally wrote the book on this stuff. And then I realized it wasn't about the damn curtain. It was about control. It was about a person who had once been a person who was pretty control oriented, not authoritative, not authoritarian as a parent. And that was the hardest thing for him, to lose control. So this was what that was all about. So.
And sometimes for me, it was about grief.
Yeah.
I was losing my mom, and she was
In
the only one
multiple
that was
ways.
right.
Yeah.
She was the only one in front of me. So
Yeah.
I was having a bad day because I was losing my mom, and she wasn't there to comfort. She's my mom. She's supposed to be there to comfort me.
Yeah. Now I lost the question again. What's the question?
How do you help people
Yeah,
get
I
to
think.
that place of renewal?
I think you say, well, and here's what you want of it. What do we need to do to get
What's the
there?
step to get
Yeah,
there?
what are some of the strategies? Yeah.
Steps. Okay. All right. I'm deeply curious about the rituals, and you talked a little bit about rituals helping us keep people kind of in our presence.
Yeah.
Can you just expand on that a bit more? I mean, you gave a wonderful example of a small ritual, and I know
Yeah.
some people are in bigger communities and there are other rituals, but
Sure.
why is it important for all of us to incorporate some type of ritual?
Well, Van Gennep, who wrote about ritual, has an interesting word for the power of ritual. He says rituals are liminal. Now that's not a word we use, right? When was the last time you ever heard somebody say, that's a very liminal thought, or something like that, right? Probably never. Actually, the only time I ever saw it in popular use was in a Simpson episode of all things, and it was used correctly.
You're a smart man.
Yeah, it was actually used correctly. You all know the word subliminal, right? Remember when we were kids, we went to the movies and we thought that every third frame said, you know, buy popcorn. You're really thirsty, you know, and many of you had that feeling when you were kids, you know, and liminal means it's on the threshold of consciousness. So we're incorporating. How many times have you been to, let's say, maybe a patriotic ritual, and you know you're certainly taking something in visually and consciously, but all of a sudden you find your tears coming to your eyes. So liminal means it affects us on the conscious and unconscious level simultaneously. That's the power of ritual. It speaks to our unconscious and it speaks to us consciously. And in my work, based on the work of Van Gennep and Van der Hart and Therese Rando, I talk about 4 different types of rituals. Rituals of continuity, which is what I explained when I talked about our Christmas tree ritual. Sometimes it's a ritual of transition. Maybe, you know, how you're going to take off a wedding ring or how you're going to do something like that. Maybe sometimes it's a ritual of reconciliation. That happens a lot in dementia, where you want to say, I'm sorry I lost it with you. And maybe write a letter and read it at the graveside or something like that. And sometimes there are rituals of affirmation that simply say, thank you, that really express that gratitude. So those would be 4 types of rituals that I would use. Yeah.
And you find that each of these rituals heals so that you can process your grief.
Yeah, each of
in
these
a new
rituals
way.
helps. I don't like to use the word healing personally.
Okay,
I'm
a doctor.
Yeah, I know. Medical model.
Yeah.
I like to use the word that over time we either accommodate or ameliorate the loss. We learn to live with the loss.
Yeah, assimilate it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. There's one question, and then I might need clarification on this one.
Okay.
But could you talk about the experience of grief while the person is still alive, ambiguous loss, and balancing grieving with caregiving?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I guess the question is ambiguous loss is termed by Pauline Boss. We've worked together at times, wonderful woman. And what she means by that is, and I would talk about that, I would use the term psychosocial loss, which is a form of ambiguous loss, that you're with the person, but not the person you really knew. The person has so changed that they're not the person they used to be. And you're grieving that loss. And remember, grief is about loss. And in dementia, as we said, you experience all kinds of losses. The loss of intimacy, the loss, and that can mean different things for a child than it does for a parent, but we still experience those losses. So we have multiplicity of losses. And I think it's just the companion of caregiving. And sometimes we just need to take time to process that. It may be writing in a journal. It may be, when I work with dying children, one time I got so upset that I went to the dump and I just started breaking bottles on the rocks.
I used an axe for a while to take, not on any human.
I was worried about that
to
actually.
To take out a tree stump.
Yeah,
I was just like, I could hire somebody, or I could process my
anger.
Yeah. Right.
So, whatever works for us.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's what I have. If there's any, no, I'm done. Do you have any final words you'd like to impart?
No, I just wonder if there are any other questions from the audience that we can take live. Well, if not, I've been really honored to be with you today. And I thank you so much for your presence here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
For participating with it. I want to thank Eleonora for bringing me out here today. I had a wonderful day, and in the downtime, I got some work done even, because I wasn't distracted by all the things that distract me at home. So thank you very, very much. And I just want to say, I wish you well. You're all on very difficult individual journeys, I suspect. I wish you well on those journeys. And remember, you don't have to walk those journeys alone. One of the things I'm so impressed with is what, over the last 2 days, I've learned a lot about CaringKind, and it's a great resource for you. So please use them.
Thank
And then always remember she was my student.
Thank you so much. Happy birthday and just a few final words here from me. I want to make sure that if those of you who are tuning in on Zoom or are in the room, we actually, part of the HALIS Summit is that we have a professional development webinar that's happening on Friday, December 6th at 12 o'clock. You've got the QR code here. We're happy to give that to you. That's a free 2-hour education program by Dr. Doka with free CEUs that you're welcome to join us for. If you are a family member, a friend, professionals, we host ongoing education events. You can find those on our website. They are robust. We are adding more and more regularly, and so we're excited to offer that. We have a couple of things in this arena. In the new year, we'll be offering a new program, a small group program for people who are supporting someone directly and who are kind of going through those early grief experiences while their person living with Alzheimer's or dementia is still alive. And so if you're interested in that, you can reach out to us and we'll let you know about that. And Dr. Kenny's actually done a 3-part education series for us already called Navigating Transitions. And the videos of those will be on our website, and we'll be hosting that again. She'll be hosting that again in the spring, so you can tune in for that opportunity. Again, I just want to remind you that if this topic struck a chord, we're here for you. Our phone number is 646-744-2900, and you can also just schedule a time with us on the website. So thank you very much again, Dr. Kenny, Dr. Doka. It's really been a pleasure. This has been so helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.